Hey there, Hour of History podcast fans. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week our guest is Sam Zygner. He wrote Baseball Under the Palms, History of the Miami Minor League Baseball in the Early Years, 1892 to 1860. This is a fascinating look at minor league ball in a absolutely stunning city that has gone through a lot of changes. We talk ball, we talk history, we talk culture, we talk about a bunch of awesome things. And as usual, the link to the book, the link to more information is at hourofhistory.com. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to check out hourofhistory.com and subscribe. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm here with Sam Zygner, who has written Baseball Under the Palms. How are you doing?
Good, I'm excellent. Thank you for having me on today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. And I always, talking about history, I always see these sort of, these regional histories as one of the most foundational parts of history. Can you tell us a little bit about your recent release and how you got into the topic?
Sure. It was born out of my first book, which was called The Forgotten Marlins, a tribute to the 1956 to 1960 original Miami Marlins. I came to the Miami area in 2001, and of course I had a natural curiosity about the history of the area, especially baseball, because I'm very much into baseball and baseball research. So as time went by and as I got to learn about the area and the history of baseball, most of the history of baseball is tied up with the Florida Marlins, which launched in 1993 as a major league team. But I found over the course of doing research and talking to a lot of people as I do, that not a lot of people knew about the history of Miami baseball, going back to the minor leagues and even further. And so that spurred an interest in me. After I had written the first book, I wanted to look a little more deeper into the history of Miami baseball, which goes back to 1892. So Baseball Under the Palms covers that area from when baseball, the first newspaper article that mentioned a baseball game, and then I carried through till 1960, which was, I considered, the early years. That went from the outlaw leagues, which were the first professional leagues that came to Miami, up through and until they had a AAA affiliate in the International League, which was the Miami Marlins, which was the first Marlins team.
It's fascinating. And so Miami is kind of an interesting city, I think. I think a lot of people have a lot of different sort of perceptions of what Miami is. I certainly remember a lot of highways when I was there. Can you describe, like, what is this city? What do you think of when you think of Miami? And maybe what are some of the changes in that long period of time for the city?
Well, Miami goes through this, it's this phenomenal growth. It's always changing. They're building new buildings. Literally, now my wife, she was from the Miami area. She's lived here almost her whole life. And just when you look at the old videos of Miami compared to now, there's so many more of these tall buildings. There's constant construction here. Of course, everybody goes and enjoys the beach. South Beach is a big deal. A lot of people come here from out of state, from the Caribbean, from South America, from all over the world, really, and to enjoy. We have this wonderful weather here. It's very hot in the summer, but for the people who, for instance, come from the north, this is like a paradise. So Miami is this constantly changing city. We have such a cultural diversity here. So many different people from not only the United States, you have people from the Caribbean, from Cuba, from Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Central America, South America, a lot of people from Argentina here, and Brazil. And so you just have this beautiful diversity of people and culture. It's a very artsy city. It's very colorful. I know that they made some changes in Miami Stadium this year, but originally, if you remember, they had a lot of bright colors. We had the display out in center field when you hit a home run, and the Dolphins went in a circle, and you had kind of a fireworks display. Almost kind of defined Miami, and it's just really a beautiful city.
And it's so the picture you're sort of painting is this like international meeting spot. If we go back to 1892, when your story sort of starts, is Miami like that?
Oh, no. In the late 1890s, coming up to that, this was an extremely sparsely populated area. You had the Seminole Indians and the Indian tribes out to the west, which were primarily out in the Everglades. And then to the ocean, you had this little area where you had what I would call hardscrabble settlers and merchants. We're talking about probably less than a few hundred people that kind of hugged the Miami River at the time. And these people eked out a living any way they could, either as merchants or raising crops. But also they had something that was called wrecking. Now, boats during the hurricane season would be carrying supplies back and forth, and they would run aground, and the people would actually scavenge the materials and either use it for their own use and turn around and sell it. So what really spurred the growth of Miami occurred in 1896 when Henry Flagler had a dream of building this railroad that would stretch from Jacksonville to Key West. When he eventually got to Miami in 1896, that's when the population began to expand. He also built the Royal Palm Hotel. Along with his railroads, he would build hotels down the railway, for instance, in St. Augustine, West Palm Beach, Miami, and so forth. And so people started coming into the area. They started seeing the opportunities that were available. And basically, Miami since then has gone through these continuous spurts of growth. It's just up to this day, it even continues.
Wow, so it's fascinating. So it's really a relatively young city, all things considered. So then who brought baseball to the city then, if it was just this slowly emerging new place?
Well, as people came into the area, you had a few of the Cuban people who they moved into the area, and they already had baseball. Baseball in Cuba started, I think, as early in the 1870s when the merchant marines went there and exposed them to the game. You had a lot of people who were coming from the Midwest and Northeast, and as these people came, they were looking for time that they could spend recreationally. And the first recorded baseball game that actually occurred in what it was Miami now occurred in 1892 on a July 4th. It was an article that was written in the Tropical Sun newspaper, which covered everything from North Palm Beach down to Key West. So you had this idyllic scene that was painted, and the two teams that played, they got people from Coconut Grove and Lemon City played. These have since been absorbed into Greater Miami-Dade, and they played a game. Lemon City prevailed in that game 18-17.
And is that would that have resembled baseball as we know it today? What would have been different?
No, I think we actually could have went back in time and participated and watched, we would have recognized the game. But I would consider it or liken it to probably a sandlot game. They got the people from the two towns, they got together. There was a social where they had food and so forth. It was a social gathering, and then they played the game as recreation. The game really didn't take off here, and this was much later than most of the country, until the 19-teens, when the Miami Baseball Association was formed, and they started a league with West Palm Beach, Fort Pierce, and Fort Lauderdale. They called it the Florida East Coast League. This was the first professional league, though it was considered at the time an outlaw league. They had a governing body called the National Association, which was over the minor league baseball in the United States. But there were outlaw leagues that were formed, and these leagues primarily depended on local talent. They would use college players, and they would scope out and recruit players from other minor leagues to come play. And that's when baseball got started here. We started having the outlaw leagues, and we actually didn't get a officially sanctioned minor league team through the National Association until 1927. But prior to that, we always had these outlaw leagues, and of course you had some really colorful characters that played in these leagues. As you might imagine, they were kind of a rough and tumble bunch in those days.
Well, so yeah, who are these people? Who's gonna go to this relatively small town and play baseball?
Well, as Miami by then had gotten bigger by the early 1910s, you probably had I'm just going to guess, a population probably in the tens of thousands by then. And a gentleman by the name of Smiley Tatum, the Tatum brothers were a group of brothers who were kind of the first to develop the Miami area for residential and commercial businesses to come and expand the area. But Smiley had this idea that he wanted to build a baseball field and attract actually Major League spring training to the area, which he did accomplish. He built what was called then Tatum Field, which was later changed to Miami Field, and he was able to lure the Boston Braves, who were the forerunners of the Atlanta Braves, to the Miami area, and they were the first team to spring train down here. But because the field was built, he was able to accommodate the minor league teams in there, where they were able to draw enough attendance. Of course, they charged ticket prices to get into the game, and then the game went from there, and you had a profitable business that started.
And could you repeat that last part? It just broke up a little bit.
Oh, okay. Once the stadium, or really was not really a stadium, but a field that was built, they were able to charge people to come into the park, to purchase a ticket, and it became a money-making business. And then you had the professional baseball, as we know it, in minor leagues down here first. That's when that all started.
And where are these athletes coming from? So are they sort of like from college, or they've tried to make it in the big leagues and they can't make it, or potential talent? Where, or just the workforce?
In the early stages, they primarily recruited from local talent. They also recruited from local colleges within the state of Florida, but they also went and recruited from other minor leagues. We're in, like, for example, North Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, as far away as Texas, and they would bring in these players from other minor leagues. These were players that were trying to work their way up in the minor leagues, and they may have got a better financial offer to come down here, so these players would come here initially.
And I know from talking to Cesar Brioso, who's written about Cuba, that at this time Cuba had different sort of racial interactions and sort of understandings of race. Are the Miami leagues totally segregated in the at the turn of the century?
No. Now, there were Cuban players that came here to play in the minor leagues and in these outlaw leagues at the time. But during this venture, we did not have actually segregation in the minor leagues in the Miami Beach, because Miami Beach would eventually also get a minor league team until 1952. That's when the Florida International League was going. And the color barrier, as far as that league, was broken in 1952 in Miami Beach, when George Handy of the Miami Beach Flamingos played second base, and then from the Havana Cubans team, which participated in that league, Silvio Garcia and Angel School both played in that game. And from that point forward, the leagues down here were segregated. Were non-segregated, I should say. They were segregated prior to that. Oh,
okay, I see. So before, and when we're talking the original leagues, are they all white or something?
Yes, at that time, the owners were very sensitive. You had the Jim Crow law, Moore's laws were probably very strong. Miami was very much a different place then. You would get the residents then called it Miami, So you had a very different mix of people that were here then. Of course, as time went by, that changed considerably.
Now, when I think of Florida these days, I mean, I went to college at Louisiana State University, so certainly football's at the top of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Why did baseball take off? Does it have something to do with the climate or the weather, or was it just the game of the day?
I think it was probably all of those things together. Of course, down here, other than the rain, you enjoy great weather. I think players came here a lot because of the attractions of Florida. When you come to Miami, you have the beaches, you have fishing, the outdoors, the better climate. Um, they tended to pay, I think, a little bit better down here in the later years in the minor leagues, especially when the Florida International League started in 1946. So a lot of these players came down here. As an example, in the Florida International League, you would have players who had finished their major league careers. A good example of that would be Whitey Platt, that played for the Miami Beach Flamingos. He had played in the big league for the Chicago White Sox, and the St. Louis Browns. Yet he came down here probably in his early to mid 30s and played at the Miami Beach. So when the Florida International League came, you would have players, a lot of them that were rising, that were coming, on their way to the major leagues, or you occasionally get these guys on the way down who were looking for, the last paycheck, holding on to the dream of playing in that league. And then, interesting thing about this, even in the early days, you had an influx of players from Cuba, you didn't have in most parts of the United States. So you had players even as early as the 19 teens, especially more so in the 1920s when they formed a team called the Miami Hustlers in the Florida State League. You had teams such as Tampa that already had Cuban players, and so obviously Miami would, looking at that talent base that they had in Cuba, which was just a rabid baseball country, they would bring in players from there also.
So there's a lot of back and forth. How come we stay in the minor leagues here? Was there ever talk of making a major league team in the early parts of the 20th century?
Not in the early parts of the 20th century. You didn't get that talk until 1956, when Bill Veeck came to town. They moved the Syracuse AAA international team to Miami. It was purchased by a gentleman by the name of Sid Solomon Jr., who later went on to own the St. Louis Blues hockey team. But he had wanted to get into a minor league franchise to kind of get his feet wet. And he had this deal that when it came up, that he, and a little story, the owner of the Syracuse Chiefs at the time was at a minor league convention. They got the minor league owners together. And Sid Solomon Jr. and his partner were sitting at a table next to Martin Haskey, who owned the Chiefs at the time. And they overheard a conversation that Haskey was having, and that he was interested in selling the team. So according to Bill Veeck, Solomon Jr. reached over the table and he said, in short order, "I'd like to purchase the team." And what he did after that is he kind of realized he had gotten a little over his head. So he contacted his good friend Bill Veeck, who is an icon in baseball. And at the time, Bill wasn't an owner of a major league team. He had been ousted from Major League Baseball temporarily. So he asked his friend to come in and help him negotiate the deal. They finalized the deal, and AAA baseball came to Miami at that time. What they had in the back of their minds was eventually bringing Major League Baseball to Miami that early. But as you know, AAA is just one step below the major leagues. So they launched that initial season, which was successful. Part of the reason was they had brought in Satchel Paige, which was an old crony kind of Bill Veeck's. He always seemed to bring Satchel back. And Satchel came to town and created a lot of excitement. They brought in a lot of major leaguers also were on the team. They had a group of Phillies prospects that were coming up. And they brought in players like Cal Abrams, who was a former Brooklyn Dodger, Pittsburgh Pirate, so forth. And so people got kind of a taste of what Major League Baseball was like. And so that's where the first conversations were of eventually bringing Major League Baseball to Miami, although it would take another 37 years before the Florida Marlins were launched.
And you mentioned there that, there was some excitement drummed up, at least in the 1950s. Miami and, well, all of Florida has a terrible reputation for people going to ball games. Was that always the case?
Well, it's funny. And when I did my research, you kind of find this pattern. When a new team would launch, you'd have this initial excitement. Attendance would be very good. And then as the years went by, you would see this kind of slow decline of attendance. And I attributed that to Miami had a lot of distractions, especially if you look back at the 40s, 50s. You, of course, had a lot of people here who were coming from other areas of the country, but you would have highlight here. They had the dog races, the horse races. You always had the beach, which was a distraction, and the whole resort hotel business. So it seemed like that over the years, what would happen, like I said, you'd have this initial excitement, and as time passed, you would see it kind of taper off. And over the years, they would have different league changes, different owners would come in. And it's funny because when I look at the Marlins today, you kind of see the same thing. The Florida Marlins, when they launched, I don't know, a lot of people remember this, but in their initial season in the major leagues, they drew over 3 million fans.
Wow.
And that's the most by far they ever drew.
And so then what is to explain it? You think it's all the distractions and just the allure of the city, or do teams like the Marlins sort of like the Marlins we know in the modern day have trouble for whatever reason keeping the sort of steam when they have success?
Well, part of the Marlins problem, to be honest with you, and this is my opinion, and I think it's pretty well documented, is they have a negative public face in the community. We've had 2 World Series champions here in the years after that they won the World Series. We had breaking downs of the team. We've had owners that up till now haven't been the best face of the franchise. The public relations probably isn't as good as in a lot of cities. And baseball has had a hard time getting a foothold. As you know, we have a lot of transient population here. A lot of people are new here. And this is all my opinion, of course. But, a lot of people who are here, they have a kind of a negative view of the Marlins as they exist today. Now, going back in time, when I wrote the book, Baseball Under the Palms, and in the early years, I think it was more, you didn't have the public relations problems. It was more the distractions of the beach and the horse racing and the highlight and the dog races and those type of, and also the entertainment industry. You had a lot of the entertainers coming down here, your Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, different people like that, which also when people would come here, they were more apt to do that than to go to a ball game.
And there's also a lot of really significant sort of economic changes happening in the United States and social changes. Maybe you can tell us how minor league baseball, especially something we kind of see as not as solid maybe as the professional leagues, survived like through, say, the Depression.
Yeah, down here, there was quite a few interruptions. As I said earlier, the 1927, when they were officially sanctioned and they started in the Florida State League, the Miami Hustlers at the time only played in 1927 and 28. By late 28, Florida was approaching this recessionary period that eventually led into the Depression. So you had interruptions going, I'm going to go back, I kind of misstepped there. World War I one time interrupted baseball down here. So they had a little gap there. It started back in the early 20s. They had some financial difficulties as a league, the Florida East Coast League. It closed down again, came back in 27 and 28, and the Depression came, and we didn't have baseball again until the 40s here, when the Florida East Coast League reformed. Again, it was interrupted due to the manpower shortage of World War II, as were most major minor leagues. They had an interruption of play. The league came back in 1946, but was renamed the Florida International League. And the reason for that was the first non-English speaking country accepted into the league was Cuba, and you had a team called the Havana Cubans that were in the Florida International League, which was a really interesting league because it was the first league that actually had, now you have to remember, this league started out as a Class C minor league that eventually went to Class B, but they had chartered flights for the teams to Cuba. So you had teams, for instance, from Tampa, which had a large Cuban population. St. Petersburg was in the league. Fort Lauderdale, we had Miami, Miami Beach. Lakeland was in the league. But in the early years, Havana was the team that like dominated the league. So you had chartered flights. You had the first truly non-English speaking country that was accepted. So, of course, baseball, they were rabid in Cuba. And then that league went up to 54. They had some financial difficulties. And then that led to the opening of the Miami Marlins of the AAA International League coming in. And of course, they participated in the same league. There was teams from Canada, as well as there was a team called the Havana Sugar Kings that was in that league.
And just not to get too off subject here, but it's fascinating question. Just last weekend here in DC, the Nationals wore Expos throwbacks.
Yes.
Do the Miami Marlins of today sort of have this understanding or respect for the rich heritage of baseball in Miami, or is there no line really drawn?
You know, there's not a lot of knowledge about the past baseball. It's kind of like in Miami, that baseball history started in 1993. And that's one of the reasons why I jumped into this book, because in most big league cities that you go to, there's a sense of their background, where the teams came from, what their history was. As an example, maybe in Boston, the Red Sox, before the Red Sox came to be, there was baseball in the area, and then the Red Sox came into the American League. But in Miami, there was kind of this empty, unexplored area of minor league baseball and baseball history going back before 1993. And as a writer, you're always looking for something that nobody has written about before, something unexplored. So when myself and my wife, who co-authored the book, got into this and we started researching it, we found it was literally a treasure trove of information on the history of baseball in the area. And I mean, it was fascinating, and things that when I talked to people, very few people knew about. And
can you talk a little bit about the sources? What was in that treasure trove? What are you using to sort of piece together this history?
Oh, we used all types of sources. You know, of course, the first place you go is the newspapers of the time, the Miami News, the Miami Herald. One of the most interesting things that we did is we looked up the ball players from the early days and I interviewed them personally.
Oh.
And interestingly enough, I was able to track down players going back as far as 1946. I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Bill Enos, who later became a famous Boston Red Sox scout, and he played for the 1946 Miami team. And then I spoke to this other gentleman who played for the 1946 Miami Beach Flamingos. His name is Gene Zabrinski. So I went back through those years, her and I researching it together, talked to these players, and we talked to some of the names you would know, some of them wouldn't be recognizable to fans today, but names like Maury Wills is an example. I interviewed him, famous, mostly famous for playing for the Dodgers. And a lot of people didn't know that he played in Miami. And of course, going back to something you had mentioned earlier about the segregation, he came to Miami at a time when segregation did exist. And he told some great stories about his teammate, Clyde Paris, who was a star in the Negro Leagues it was a team called the New York Black Yankees at the time. And he talked about how he mentored him and helped him get through these difficult times down here. And Later, Satchel Paige came down here, and he had to experience segregation. He had to live in a separate area of town, he was old hat. He knew what a black player had to go through at this time. But interestingly enough, he was extremely popular in Miami, and just to show you how popular he was, Bill Veeck organized a baseball game that they played in the Orange Bowl. This was the initial season in 1956. Mm-hmm. And they kind of shoehorned this baseball park into the Orange Bowl, a football stadium. And they attracted over 50,000 fans for that game. It was, of course, made nationwide news. And it was quite an event at the time.
And were they getting much press in the newspapers? Were ball games being written about with interest, or were they just kind of put to the side and then the MLB scores right front and center?
Well, people had a lot of interest in Major League Baseball, but because of the distance, especially in the early years, people obviously couldn't attend Major League games, so they were pretty avid followers of the local team. Going back to the 1913, when the first Outlaw League team started, they actually made front page news. But over the years, even with the minor league teams, there was a lot of coverage. They pretty much were front page coverage the whole time that I covered, from the early teens to the 1960, which was the last year that the Miami Marlins were here when they moved. But the coverage was very good. Front page in the sports section. Sometimes if it was an important game, as an example, if the teams made playoffs or were in a championship series or a game, actually made front page of the Miami News or Miami Herald at the time. So down here, the coverage for baseball, when I did the research, both of us did research, I should say, we didn't have any problem getting a lot of accounts of games, interviews that the reporters who were the beat writers at the time would cover. They would interview the players. So there was a vast amount of information available. We also gathered other information, of course, from doing the personal interviews with the players, also the surviving players.
It's very fascinating. And one of the things that is really attractive of like sort of minor league ball and must have been fun for you is some of these names are hilarious, with the flamingos and so on. And what about like the ball caps and the uniforms? Did you get a sense of how that sort of identity was created?
Yes. In fact, the Miami team, which was at different times they were called the Sun Sox. They were called the Wahoos, which is a game fish off the coast of Florida. The Tourists and the Marlins, they maintained these colors of very similar to the New York Mets. You had the orange and I guess you would call it a medium blue, but it was a bright color. So the teams in general tended to have a more colorful appearance when they took the field. The Flamingos were, other than their first season, were red, white, and blue. Their first season, they were actually green and orange, but they changed that after the first year, which happenstance was the same color, the green and orange of the University of Miami. Exactly. So, but they always had this, they were a little bit more flamboyant sometimes than the other teams.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. I mean, the University of Miami would have had its own baseball team. Would they ever compete in like a minor league tournament or something?
No, sometimes during spring training they would play the University of Miami in spring training ball. Sometimes they would play other college teams, as a warm up to the season. But in general, no tournaments or anything like that.
And as time went on in Miami, and the population was shifting and the city developing, I mean, you get towards the 1960s and the pretty, incredible events that are happening in Cuba with the revolution. How did that change baseball in Miami?
Well, that started about in 59. A lot of the Cuban players who were playing Major League Ball at the time, it was a difficult time for them. The Havana Sugar Kings at the time, which were in the AAA International League were eventually forced to leave. The conditions became such that they couldn't continue to play in Havana, and they moved that team to New Jersey. Obviously, a lot of these ball players came to the States and never went back to Cuba. Hopefully, mostly they were able to bring their families over here. Some weren't. So it was a very difficult time for those men. A lot of those men settled here in Florida and lived here in their major league careers, even though it wasn't in the Miami area. They would, of course, live here, and then after they retired, they were still involved in baseball or began their other careers. But that was always a hard thing for them because many of them didn't return to Cuba, or maybe didn't go there until they were much older. And like I say, sometimes they had to, it's hard to imagine. I can't even imagine what they went through being separated from family members, even for a short time. It was difficult.
Right. And you bring the book up to 1960. What happens in 1960 that makes this sort of the end of the early years?
Okay. Well, what happened is the Miami Marlins by then, they had a great initial season, a winning season, went to the playoffs, a lot of excitement. Bill Veeck left after that first year. He eventually returned to Major League Baseball as an owner again. But the team started kind of there again. People lost interest. They'd never had another winning season after the first season. And by 1960, the team had gotten in financial straits. The second owner, George Storer, who owned Storer Communications and a station down here called WGBS, amongst other stations that he owned. He sold the club to a gentleman by the last name of McDonald. McDonald was very excited when he first came in, but things did not go so well. And he ended up moving the team to Puerto Rico the next season, which only lasted temporarily. And then they eventually moved that team that same year to Charleston, West Virginia. Ironically, this is a funny story. When they moved to Charleston, the team was in such financial straits. They still had the Marlins uniforms. So they kept the team name, but they likened it to a rifle called the Marlin rifle, and they covered the patches up and so forth and tried their best to save money.
Now, is this a sort of like unavoidable thing in minor leagues, moving, changing names, folding? What causes that?
I think in the olden days, back in those years, it was a difficult financial prospect versus today. The stadiums weren't quite as nice as they are now. I think minor league teams are much more stable. You have better support from the major leagues for their minor league teams. I think people have grown over the years, and I know myself, I really enjoy going to minor league games. My wife and I sometimes travel up to Palm Beach, and we catch Jupiter Hammerhead to the Palm Beach Cardinals games. We have this more of a feeling of intimacy when you go to those games. I think you can get down closer to the field. The players are a little bit more approachable and so forth. So I know myself and Barbara, we've always been very attracted to minor league baseball, and of course Barbara grew up in a baseball family. Her father played minor league baseball. Ironically enough, he played for the Miami Beach Flamingos in 1949 and 1950. He was a catcher for the club.
Wow. And so you must have, compiling all these sources, you must have memorabilia and documents like this. Is there any sort of a public memory or museum or depository for these oral histories? Is there any sort of place for these things?
Well, the Miami Marlins as a team, they do have a few minor things. They don't have a lot in their collection. They do have some murals inside of the park that you can see that has, they're kind of like that they've put on the wall. They're not actual photos, but they paint them on the wall of the past that you can see. For instance, there's a mural of Satchel Paige when he pitched in the Orange Bowl game. And there's a picture of a gentleman by the name of Woody Smith, who was a baseball icon down here in Miami for years prior to the Major League Baseball coming here. They have a few pieces of memorabilia, but not a lot. It's something that I'm trying to work with the Marlins and make more contact with them
Hmm.
to see if they can focus more on that. You know, in the past, they've had these throwback games where they've worn the old Miami Marlins jerseys and the Miami Sun Sox jerseys.
Oh.
And so there has been a little bit of connection, but it goes back to this in Miami, and not a lot of people have this knowledge of what baseball was before 1993.
Hmm.
So I guess Barbara and I, what we're trying to do is educate people, and people, as we speak to groups, meet different people, you know, they get more fascinated by this history because they don't have any idea what happened. You know, it's interesting because when you look back at the history here, you've had Hall of Famers pass through here. As an example, Joe Ducky Medwick, Max Carey, Paul Wainer, who were Hall of Famers at one time, managed clubs in Miami. Pepper Martin, the wild horse of the Osage, was a baseball icon down here as a manager for Miami clubs in Miami and Miami Beach. And you had guys who made it to the big leagues who were down here. Gene Beard and Bobby Hogue. Maury Wills played here. Whitey Platt. You had these guys, and really when the AAA team came here, you had a slew of players in the Phillies organization and later the Orioles organization that played at Miami Stadium that all made it to the big leagues. So there is this history of a lot of interesting characters. Some of them, like Pepper Martin, who was from the old St. Louis Cardinals Gas House gang. You know, he'd take his players out fishing when he was a manager, and sometimes he'd lose track of time. And the ball players that were with him would say, "Hey, Pepper, we got a game tonight at 6:00. We need to head back." They'd go out fishing out, you know, in the Everglades or at Lake Okeechobee, so they'd have to rush back for the game. You know, you had these great stories, and Ducky Medwick was down here. He managed the 49 Flamingos. He later became a Hall of Famer, and he was known to be a golfer. He'd go out and golf and sometimes take the players out to golf, and he'd have a cigar and so forth. And, you know, there was a lot of interesting stories. I mean, just literally around Satchel Paige alone, you could write a book about his Miami experiences. Satchel was, you know, one of the most colorful characters that ever came across baseball's landscape. And he, you know, he'd come into the locker room, he'd go fishing, and he'd bring his fish in the locker room and hang them up and stink up the locker room. And he would, to keep his arm in shape, this is interesting, he would purchase a snake oil that he said that he purchased from some South Dakota Indians, and he wouldn't tell anybody what it was made of. He would rub this on his arm, and he would also go in the locker room and run scalding hot water over his arms to keep his arm loose. The players that I interviewed said that they don't know how he could stand to do that, but you know, the guy pitched into his 60s.
Yeah. Well, and so do you find most people that hear about your book, do they know anything about this topic? Or are you finding it's mostly people who are invested in baseball already? Who's sort of picking up interest in this?
Well, I think a little of both. Of course, you get the guys who are the baseball, you know, experts or have a pretty good knowledge of baseball, and you get the other group that jumps into it, goes, "Hey, I want to learn about this. I don't know about this." I think probably that's a little bit larger group than the former.
Oh, okay. And you've done quite a bit of baseball research. Can you talk a little bit about this organization?
You're referring to the Society for American Baseball Research?
Right. Yeah.
That's a group that was formed in the 1970s, and it's a group that's dedicated to the research of baseball history. Now, within the organization, we've kind of expanded over the years. I think we have over 6,500 members worldwide now. And you have people from all walks of life in it. You have people, excuse me, like myself, that's a writer. There's some people interested more in the statistical end, and so you hear about this, you know, the sabermetrics and how it's tied into Major League Baseball, studying numbers and so forth. There's people who are just interested, they're baseball fans. Other people are interested in, you know, the old Negro leagues. Everybody has a different interest. Mine happens to be in the minor leagues in Miami right now.
And yeah, and so there's chapters all over the United States, all over the world.
There's chapters all through the United States. We have chapters in Japan, England, down in the Caribbean. I'm trying to think internationally, but it's not coming to me right now. But we do have chapters throughout the world. The highest concentration is here in the United States, of course. I run the South Florida chapter down here, which is in South Florida. We have from West Palm Beach down to Key West. But just in Florida alone, I think we have 4 chapters now.
Wow. And so this is something that's always kind of fascinated me. I love using sports history, especially when I teach. And baseball seems to lend itself to historical inquiry, to statistical analysis, why is that? Why is baseball so, it attracts a certain kind of crowd that tends to be good at compiling documents and stats and so on and memories. Do you have any ideas why?
Wow, that's a great question. I think it goes back to, at one time, baseball was the game, the only game. And I think that when that happened in the early days, it formed a basis that, the fathers passed it down to their children and children to their children and so forth. So there's always this connection to the past. I know I have that same connection going back as far as my great-grandfather. And so, when you're raised around the game and you see it so much and you hear stories from your grandfather telling stories and your father telling stories, that it plants a seed in you. And I think over the years, as people have, obviously gotten older, you kind of look to the past. You want to remember, those golden days, so to speak. And baseball why had it always been tied to numbers? That goes back to the early days where they wanted to, quantify players, who was better. And there was always these arguments, Joe DiMaggio better than Mickey Mantle, as an example? Or was Ted Williams better than Joe DiMaggio? And so you always have this argument, and people would try to quantify it with statistics. And I think also that when Major League Baseball teams, as they matured and they realized the importance of these statistics, they took a closer look at these type of things, and they began to find trends. And I think one thing led to another, and now baseball is dominated by statistics.
Yeah, and it really does lend itself to that sort of statistical mind, maybe more so than other sports. It's hard to tell. Now, looking into the future a little bit, I know your Baseball Under the Palms is a historical work looking backwards. But what do you see the outlook for the game for minor league ball?
Oh, I think it'll continue to grow. I have no doubt. The Major League Baseball is stretching out internationally now. We just had that game in London, England. And baseball is very strong internationally in Korea, in Japan, in South America, in the Caribbean. They even have professional leagues in Australia and in certain countries in Europe. I think that I like to see Major League Baseball reaching out. And I still continue to grow. There's a lot of competition out there. Of course, you have football, basketball, hockey here in the States. Soccer is gaining a lot of momentum now. But I think baseball will always have its place. I don't know as if it will always be the number one sport, but I think it's always going to be near the top. If not the top, I think it can get there again with some changes. But I think baseball is going to stay strong. I really do.
And even specifically in Miami, you've got this new David Beckham engineered soccer team and the ever-growing, ever-international, ever-diverse population. You think there's still a place for Marlins in their beautiful stadium?
Oh, yeah. And I think, what my hope is with the new ownership that we see a turnaround, that we get a little more stability here. I think if people can get that bond with the team where we don't have that constant, building and tearing down aspect of the team going on. I think that people get a connection. It took a while in cities like Boston, Chicago, and St. Louis to form this bond. It's going to take a long time here. And I think you will see that over time.
Yeah, and I feel like it's such a shame with the Miami Marlins, the changing identities, like the new logos, new colors. Like it's really hard to sort of develop a bond with the team if you're always changing, right?
Exactly, and more so with the personnel changes they have. We've had a lot of great players come in here briefly and go, and we need a connection with a player. As an example, in Kansas City with a George Brett, or in Boston with a David Ortiz. I can name a ton of Yankees.
Yeah.
The Cubs with Chris Bryant and Rizzo. That. And in the past, the players like Ernie Banks with the Cubs, that type of connection, fans grew up with those players and they developed a relationship. We have very few players in Miami. The only example I can really think of off the top of my head is Jeff Conine, who they call Mr. Marlin. So, I think as time goes by and if we can get a little more stability, in my opinion, I think you'll see that closer relationship with the team and the fan support will improve.
That's it. Hopefully, I would hope so. It's always fun. I have to say kind of a flippant comment, but I have seen the Marlins on many occasions, mostly because when they come to town, the ticket price drops a little bit. So it's a kind of, I have this like fun sort of visiting fan perspective where I've seen them on so many occasions. It's kind of like, oh, it's fun. The Marlins are in town. I'm going to go to a baseball game. But anyway, we're drawing close to the hour here, and we usually finish up the hour of history with a suggestion. So, Sam, if you could suggest anything to the listeners of the hour of history, of course, they're going to have links to buy your book and read Baseball Under the Palms so they can get a better idea of these, the fascinating changes that Miami went through and these fascinating teams and interesting players and great stories. But besides the book, what would you suggest to the audience?
Well, my suggestion would be is just, make a connection with the game. Go to your local games. I suggest minor league games a lot as well as major league games. If you want to get a more of a touch of intimacy with the game, go to your local minor league teams. If you're in a city where you're near a minor league team or in a minor league city, that you can attend those games. I know down here with the Florida State League, they're a lot of fun. Most of the games, there's unless it's a special promotion night, you may have 1,000, 1,500 people in the stands. The games that my wife and I go to, we can usually sit down right by the dugout. They don't usually assign you a seat. It's kind of first come, first serve. I would read about baseball, learn about the game and its past. There's a lot of great books. One of my favorite books, and really a book that had a lot of influence on my life, was the Lawrence Ritter book, Glory of Their Time, where he interviewed players back from the turn of the century up in the 40s. But there's a lot of great baseball books out there. And my suggestion is get to know the game. There's more to the game than just the surface of it. Kind of study about the game, the little intricacies that you don't necessarily think about. But if you how the shortstop's position, why the catcher's doing what he's doing, why they're batting a certain batter in a certain situation. That's what I guess what I would suggest to somebody. And
yeah, I think it's fascinating. And it is a good suggestion to get to know the game. And as you get to know the game, it definitely becomes more rewarding. And I would also sort of like, just to continue on with that suggestion is even people who might not think that they're interested in the game, like even if you're not like totally into sports or whatever, the cultural window that baseball sort of opens is just fascinating. And so my suggestion is kind of similar, but a little different. I'm suggesting listen to at least one baseball game on the radio.
Yes.
Which is just like, this is something I started doing recently this year, is like just kind of sitting outside and listening to a ball game on the radio. When I lived in Philly, it was great. People would go into parks and actually still do this. and you think, that might not happen all over the place, but people gather and just listen. And baseball commentators are really gems, because they describe it. They have soothing voices. You can hear the crowd. It's not too much happening where you miss action, because it's described so clearly. So I really sort of endorse that radio activity. Yeah.
I agree with you. And really, the great thing about listening to baseball on the radio is it spurs the imagination. It really gets you thinking. You're not actually at the game, but in your mind, you picture what's going on.
Exactly. And we've almost become too spoiled with this sort of technology, especially around baseball, with that imaginary strike zone that appears on television screens. And if you go to MLB.com, they give you the sort of like exactly where the pitch went, but you're exactly right. That really does deaden the imagination.
Yes. And I can remember as a kid, listening to the games back when they had transistor radios. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but listening to, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and listening to the Pirates game on my little handheld transistor radio. And even when you would go to games in Forbes Field, people would be in the crowd, and watching the game, but listening to the commentary. And you have those, those great colorful announcers, much like they have today. You have some characters out there, and it was just a whole new dimension to the game,
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, is there anything else you'd like to add as we close out this hour of history?
No, I appreciate you having me on. It was really a pleasure speaking with you and sharing baseball under the palms with the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You've heard just a little teaser here of Baseball Under the Palms, the history of Miami minor league baseball in the early years, 1892 to 1860. Thank you so much, Sam Zygner.
All right.
On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.